Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be diving into Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Oh, a classic.
It is. And, this book has been a bestseller for almost a century.
Yeah.
So we're going to be looking at why that is, what makes it so enduring, and what are some of those core principles of effective communication that it lays out?
Sounds fascinating. I mean, just the title alone, How to Win Friends and Influence People, it's a little bit,
Yeah, it can be a little off-putting, can it?
yeah, a little, at first glance, it might sound a little bit manipulative almost, like some kind of a self-help gimmick.
Right.
But, when you actually delve into the book, it's actually quite the opposite. Carnegie was really advocating for genuine connection as the foundation for positive influence. And I think that's something that, really resonates with people even today.
And it's amazing how he starts the book, right? He kicks it off with this example of Two Gun Crowley, this notorious criminal. And even during his crime spree, Crowley believed that he had a kind heart.
Oh, interesting.
It really makes you wonder, how often do we miss the mark when we try to understand others, and how much, how we see ourselves, even when our actions might suggest otherwise.
It's so true. And I think, it highlights how deeply ingrained that resistance to self-criticism is in all of us. And, Carney argues that understanding this is absolutely fundamental to effective communication. And in fact, he actually cites the warden of Sing Sing prison.
Oh, wow.
Who observed that even hardened criminals rarely see themselves as the bad guy, right? They rarely see themselves as the villain of their own story.
It's incredible. It really makes you think twice about relying on criticism to get your point across.
Absolutely. And in fact, Carnegie argues that, criticism often backfires, right? So instead of changing behavior, it often just makes people defensive, more entrenched in their own viewpoints. And he contrasts this, he provides this great contrast with a story about a safety coordinator who actually convinced workers to wear hard hats, not by just, enforcing rules or yelling at them,
right,
but by actually understanding their concerns and kind of really tapping into that human element.
Yeah. It completely flips the script on how we typically approach these situations, right?
Yeah.
So instead of focusing on forcing compliance, this coordinator actually changed behavior by showing empathy and understanding.
And he achieved, lasting results by focusing on that human element. And Carnegie argues that this is far more effective than simply trying to prove someone wrong or telling them what to do, right? And he even uses this great historical example of Theodore Roosevelt and President Taft to illustrate this point. Roosevelt was famous for his very blunt, very direct, very critical style of communication. And his criticisms of Taft, although they were very powerful and very eloquent, they didn't actually change Taft's opinions or his behavior.
Interesting. So instead of going into attack mode, right, Carnegie suggests that we kind of take a step back and say, okay, what are this person's motivations? What are their fears? What are their concerns?
Exactly. And this is where Carnegie's principles for positive communication really come into play. He advocates for leading with understanding and empathy, right? Rather than criticism and judgment. So, for example, instead of focusing on someone's faults, he emphasizes giving honest and sincere appreciation.
It's refreshing to hear this. I mean, it goes against so much of what we're told, right? About holding people accountable and, giving direct feedback, all of that.
Absolutely. And Carnegie's approach, it's not about letting things slide, right?
Yeah.
It's not about avoiding accountability. It's about recognizing that people are much more receptive to your message. They're much more open to hearing what you have to say when they feel valued and respected.
When they feel heard.
When they feel heard, exactly.
This reminds me of that incredible story about Bob Hoover, the test pilot,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Who showed just incredible compassion to this mechanic who had almost caused a fatal crash.
Right.
And, instead of blaming and reprimanding, Hoover actually gave the guy another chance, really recognizing that everyone makes mistakes, and it's how we respond to those mistakes that really matters.
Absolutely. He understood the power of giving people a chance to redeem themselves, right?
Yeah.
And it speaks volumes about recognizing that human need for second chances and the positive impact that can have on people.
It's a powerful example of how building someone up can be far more effective than tearing them down.
Exactly. And it's a perfect illustration of Carnegie's emphasis on making people feel important, right?
Yeah.
And this ties in beautifully with another story that he shares called Father Forgets.
Oh, right.
Which highlights this, this universal longing to feel appreciated and valued, especially by those closest to us.
And how often, as parents, for example, we forget to do that. We get so caught up in the day-to-day.
That we forget to really acknowledge and appreciate the good things that our kids are doing.
It's so true. And it's a reminder that even those small acts of kindness, those small gestures of appreciation, can have a profound impact on our relationships.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's really all about understanding the psychology behind human interaction, right?
Absolutely.
And how that plays into building, strong, positive relationships. So have you ever noticed this tendency in yourself, right? This desire to feel valued and appreciated?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's something we all experience.
We all do.
But it's so easy to forget how much those small gestures of acknowledgement can mean to others, right?
Exactly. And Carnegie reminds us that this need is as relevant today in the digital age as it was back then, right? Whether it's online or offline, those core principles, they remain the same.
That's such a good point. I mean, in today's digital world, it's even easier to fall into the trap of criticism and negativity, right? Like, it's almost become the norm. It's so easy to hide behind a screen and fire off a quick, angry comment or get into an argument without really thinking about the impact of our words.
Right.
But Carnegie's principles offer such a powerful antidote to that.
They do. They really do. By choosing understanding over judgment and focusing on building genuine connections, we can create a more positive and fulfilling experience, both online and offline.
And I think that's a message that's really worth exploring further.
Absolutely. So let's dive into some more specific examples of how we can apply Carnegie's principles in our daily lives.
Sounds good to me.
It's fascinating how Carnegie doesn't just preach these principles, He brings them to life with all these compelling stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like the one about Lincoln, choosing not to send that angry letter to General Meade.
Right.
Talk about a lesson in self-control.
It's a perfect example of how, taking a moment to step back and choose empathy over those kind of immediate reactions can really lead to much better outcomes, I think.
Lincoln understood that sending that letter, it would have, probably damaged his relationship with Meade and just hindered their ability to work together effectively.
Absolutely. And it just makes you wonder how many conflicts we could avoid in our own lives.
Right.
If we, just paused for a second and considered the other person's perspective before reacting. And I think, that brings us to another key principle that Carnegie really emphasizes throughout the book, which is make the other person feel important and do it sincerely.
That's one that I've wrestled with a little bit,
Yeah.
Because it sounds so good on the surface.
Yeah.
But how do we actually do that authentically without it feeling manipulative,
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think it's important to remember that Carnegie isn't suggesting that we, shower people with empty compliments or try to butter them up in some way.
Right.
What he's really tapping into is this fundamental human need to feel valued and appreciated.
Yeah.
Right. And when we acknowledge someone's worth genuinely, we create this sense of connection that fosters, really positive and healthy relationships.
So it's really about recognizing that everyone has something valuable to offer.
Right.
And acknowledging that sincerely.
Absolutely. And it can be, it doesn't have to be some grand gesture. It can be as simple as remembering their name, actively listening to their ideas, expressing, genuine appreciation for their efforts, even if they're small.
Right.
Those seemingly small gestures can go a long way in building rapport and, making people feel valued.
Carnegie also talks about the importance of talking in terms of the other person's interests.
Yes.
How does that play into, making them feel important?
Well, I think when you talk in terms of someone else's interests, what you're really doing is you're showing that you're making an effort to see things from their perspective.
Right.
Which is a really powerful way to build rapport and understanding.
Yeah.
So, yeah, instead of just focusing solely on your own agenda or your own interests, you're demonstrating a genuine interest in their world, and that can go a long way.
That makes a lot of sense. But what about those situations, where we have to address a problem or a disagreement?
Mm-hmm.
Because Carnegie seems to advocate for just avoiding arguments altogether.
Yeah.
But isn't a healthy debate a good thing?
He's not saying that we should shy away from all conflict. What
Yeah.
he's saying is that, heated arguments where people are just trying to, score points or prove each other wrong,
Right.
those are rarely productive.
Yeah.
And they tend to create defensiveness, and they shut down communication rather than fostering it.
So how do we navigate, those disagreements effectively without getting, like, swept up in the heat of the moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Carnegie, he suggests that instead of, going into an argument with the goal of winning,
Yeah.
try to seek common ground, even if it's, a small area of agreement, and acknowledge the validity of the other person's perspective, even if you don't fully agree with it. It's about having a conversation, not a battle.
So instead of trying to win an argument, right, the focus should be on really trying to understand the other person's viewpoint.
Exactly.
And then hopefully finding, a solution that works for both sides.
Exactly. He really emphasizes the power of empathy in bridging divides and building those, stronger relationships. And he believed that, seeking to understand another person's perspective is always going to be more productive than trying to force them to see things your way.
It's a powerful reminder that sometimes listening with the intent to understand can be more persuasive than any argument.
Absolutely. And it's such a valuable skill to cultivate, especially in today's world where, it feels like polarization and division are on the rise.
Yeah. Speaking of today's world, we've talked a lot about the, winning friends aspect of Carnegie's book.
Okay.
But how do his principles, translate to influencing people in a way that is genuine and ethical?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, for Carnegie, he really believed that true influence, it's not about manipulation or coercion. It's about inspiring others to want to follow your lead, right? So it's about, earning their trust and respect through that genuine connection and understanding that we've been talking about.
So it's about leading by example, demonstrating integrity.
Absolutely.
And creating, a shared vision that resonates with others.
Exactly. It's a far cry from that image of, the slick salesman using, tricks and gimmicks to get what they want.
Right.
Carnegie believed that the most effective way to influence people is to appeal to their best selves, not their insecurities. And he argued that, by focusing on building those genuine relationships and understanding others' needs, we can really create a more positive and collaborative world.
Now, while Carnegie's insights are incredibly valuable, no book is without its limitations, right? Some critics have argued that his approach can be perceived as maybe a little bit too focused on self-interest.
Okay.
How to win friends and influence people. It's,
Right, the title itself.
It might suggest a self-serving motive. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a valid point. I mean, the title itself can definitely, raise an eyebrow or two. But I think if we look closely at the principles themselves, that the core principles that Carnegie lays out, they're ultimately about fostering better relationships and, really trying to create a more positive impact on the world.
It seems like it all kind of boils down to intent, right?
Exactly.
Are we using these principles to manipulate others for personal gain? Or are we using them to really foster genuine connection and understanding?
You hit the nail on the head. It's all about how we choose to apply these principles, right? And when they're used with authenticity, with a genuine desire to connect with others, they can be incredibly powerful tools for positive change.
So while the book's title might raise an eyebrow, right? It's that underlying message of genuine human connection.
Absolutely.
That I think makes it so enduring.
Yeah. And it's a message that really transcends time,
Yeah.
I think it's as relevant today as it was back then.
Now, you mentioned that, Carnegie himself wasn't perfect.
Right. Of course not. None of us are.
Are there any specific weaknesses in his approach that, we should be aware of?
I think some people argue that his emphasis on, winning and influencing can sometimes overshadow the importance of, authenticity and genuine self-expression.
Okay, that's a good point.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that, building those genuine connections should never come at the expense of our own values and our own integrity.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between, being true to ourselves and also effectively navigating the complexities of human interaction.
And I think it's important to remember, too, that Carnegie was writing at a very different time.
Absolutely.
The world was, on the brink of war. There was a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty. And so his message of hope and human connection, it was probably incredibly powerful in that context.
Oh, I'm sure it was. And while the world has changed dramatically since then, the fundamental human need for connection, that remains constant.
It does. It makes you wonder if we've lost sight of that a little bit.
Yeah.
In our fast-paced digital world.
Perhaps. But I think that's also why, books like How to Win Friends and Influence People, they continue to resonate with people because they remind us of those timeless principles, right?
Right.
That underpin that genuine human connection.
And those principles are just as important now as they ever were.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the limitations of criticism, the power of empathy, and the importance of making people feel important.
We did?
We even touched on how these principles can apply, to our online interactions.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack in Carnegie's work, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
Right. In the final part of our deep dive, we're going to delve into some of the more specific strategies that he offers for applying these principles in, real-world situations.
Yes, and we'll continue this discussion about, the book's relevance in today's digital age and explore how we can all benefit from, this timeless wisdom. So stay tuned for that.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into how to win friends and influence people. So we've been talking about, some of Carnegie's core principles, right, for building those strong relationships and, creating that positive influence. So now I think it'd be great to, to kind of explore some more specific strategies, right, for putting these ideas into action.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the most crucial strategies that Carnegie highlights, and maybe one of the most challenging, frankly, is, becoming genuinely interested in other people.
It's funny, he dedicates a whole chapter to just being a good listener.
Right.
Which is something, we often take for granted, but it really is an art form when you think about it.
It really is. And it's more than just, passively hearing words. It's about being present, being curious, truly engaged in what that other person is communicating.
Yeah, and it's humbling, right? To think about how often we're just waiting for our turn to talk.
Oh, absolutely.
Instead of really absorbing what the other person is saying.
It's so true.
And think about how it feels, right? When someone truly listens to you, it just makes you feel seen, heard, validated.
It's powerful.
It's powerful, yeah, and it lays that foundation right for deeper connection.
Absolutely.
So being a good listener, it's more than just being polite.
Right.
It's actually a key, I think, to unlocking, those meaningful connections.
But influence.
Yeah, and that positive influence.
Yeah, it demonstrates respect. And it opens the door, I think, for genuine dialogue and understanding.
Yeah, totally. Carnegie also, he stresses the importance of remembering and using people's names, which, is that really such a game changer? I'll admit, I struggle with names sometimes.
I think we all do, to be honest. But, Carnegie reminds us that, a person's name is so incredibly significant to them, right?
Yeah.
It's a symbol of their identity, their individuality.
Right.
And when you remember someone's name, what you're signaling to them is that you see them, right?
Yeah.
You value them as a person.
It's so simple, but it's powerful.
It is. And, it reminds me of that quote, "You can make more friends in 2 months by becoming interested in other people than you can in 2 years by trying to get other people interested in you."
Oh, that's a good one.
It really encapsulates, I think, Carnegie's whole philosophy, right? It's about shifting that focus away from ourselves and towards others.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about, this idea of winning people to your way of thinking.
Yeah.
Any tips, right, for navigating those conversations without, triggering defensiveness or getting into an argument?
Carnegie offers a piece of advice that might surprise you. He says the best way to win an argument is to avoid it altogether.
Wait, really?
Yeah, think about it. Have you ever really changed your mind because someone just argued you into it?
Honestly, probably not. It usually just makes me dig in my heels even more.
Exactly. And I think that's true for a lot of people. Arguments often just make people feel cornered, defensive, even if deep down they realize that maybe there are some flaws in their reasoning.
Yeah, you don't want to back someone into a corner.
Yeah.
So how do we effectively persuade people then without resorting to those arguments, right? How do we get our points across without triggering that kind of defensive reaction?
Well, Carnegie suggests, starting by finding common ground.
Yeah.
Even if it's something small.
Right.
Just look for those areas where you agree, acknowledge those points.
Yeah, so it's about building a bridge instead of creating a wall.
Exactly. And it's also about respecting the other person's opinions, even if you don't share them, right? Yeah. Instead of telling them they're wrong, which, immediately shuts down communication, try to understand why they hold those views.
Yeah.
Ask questions, listen actively to their perspective.
Right, and I think that takes a lot more effort and patience.
It does.
But it seems like a much more effective approach in the long run.
It is, building that trust and respect. It takes time, it takes effort.
Yeah.
But it's the foundation for any lasting influence.
for sure.
Hmm.
So we've talked about winning friends, influencing people.
Right.
But what about, taking on a leadership role?
Mm-hmm.
Does Carnegie offer any advice, on how to become a more effective leader?
Oh, absolutely. And his advice on leadership is very much in line with, a lot of the principles we've already been discussing. He stresses the importance of beginning with praise and honest appreciation.
Right.
Catch people doing things right,
Yeah.
acknowledge their efforts. That's so important. It's so easy to just, to focus on correcting mistakes. But acknowledging those positive contributions, I think, can be so much more motivating.
It is, and it's so much more effective. And, when you do need to offer correction or criticism,
Right.
do it indirectly, do it with kindness.
Right.
Focus on helping that person learn and grow rather than making them feel embarrassed or ashamed.
It reminds me of that story again about Bob Hoover
Right.
and the mechanic. He could have just publicly shamed that guy, but he chose to handle that situation with grace and understanding,
Right.
which ultimately, helped the mechanic redeem himself.
It's a powerful example of, how great leaders inspire and elevate others, even in those difficult situations.
Now, shifting gears a little bit here, how do you think Carnegie's ideas translate to the digital age?
Mm-hmm.
Can we apply these principles to our online interactions, especially with, all the negativity that we see in the digital space?
It's interesting because I think his insights are even more relevant now than ever.
Right. I mean, think about how easy it is to just, fire off a critical comment
Oh, yeah.
or engage in an online argument
So easy.
without, giving it much thought. It's like everyone have a megaphone and an opinion, right?
Right, and a platform.
And a platform.
Yeah.
And often those opinions are expressed with very little consideration for the person on the other side of the screen.
Yeah, it's a breeding ground for negativity. But that's exactly why I think applying Carnegie's principles,
Right.
right,
Right.
of empathy, understanding, respect, it's so crucial in online spaces.
I agree.
So before we hit send on that angry tweet or comment,
Yeah.
right, I think it's worth taking a moment, to consider how we can express our views in a way that fosters connection and not division.
Absolutely. It's about remembering that there's a human being on the other side of the screen, someone with their own thoughts and feelings and experiences.
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into how to win friends and influence people, what are some, key takeaways, right, for our listeners to kind of consider and maybe, apply in their own lives?
I think one of the most important takeaways from Carnegie's work is that building genuine connections is really the cornerstone of both personal and professional success.
It's about understanding human nature, recognizing that everyone wants to feel valued, respected, heard.
And it's about choosing our words and actions with intention,
Yeah.
right? Really focusing on creating a positive impact on the people around us.
It's a timeless message that, resonates just as strongly today as it did, almost a century ago.
It truly is.
And it's a message that, I think we can all benefit from embracing and incorporating into our daily lives.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the importance of empathy, the power of sincere appreciation, the art of winning people to your way of thinking without, resorting to those arguments. We've also talked about the challenges and the opportunities, I think, of applying these principles in today's digital world.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation.
And while, no book is a magic bullet, I think How to Win Friends and Influence People really does offer some valuable insights and some practical tools for navigating the complexities of human interaction.
I agree.
It's a reminder, that building those strong relationships, fostering that genuine connection,
Yeah,
it's a journey, not a destination.
absolutely.
And it's a journey that requires ongoing effort, self-awareness, and a willingness to really embrace those principles of understanding, respect, and genuine connection.
Well said.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Dale Carnegie's, timeless wisdom. Until next time, remember that the power to create positive change, it really does start with each and every one of us.